So, for part six now, we're going to talk about the reign of Elizabeth I. So, first thing that we want to say is that Elizabeth I was nicknamed the Virgin Queen. That was her nickname. And the reason why they called her the Virgin Queen was because she never married. So she never married, which at that time was considered something totally unheard of, especially from royalty, because the expectation was to marry and produce an heir and all those types of things. But Elizabeth never did. And there's some questions as to why she never married. And so some kind of speculate or guess that it was because of either her childhood abuse from Thomas Seymour. That's one theory, which I told you about before, that kind of traumatized her. And so as a result, she was not interested in marrying from the abuse from Thomas Seymour. Um, Others think that it was her love for a married man named Robert Dudley, that she was in love with Robert Dudley. He was one of the nobles within kind of English society, and Robert Dudley was married and uh, wouldn't leave his wife. His wife had also a very highly established title in that time, and it just would have looked bad. And so, while the two were lovers, that he wouldn't leave his wife, and so the queen, not being able to be with the person she wanted to be, just never married. So that's also an idea they have. And then the third idea they have is that she was just unwilling to share her power with a man, that she was very strong and independent and knew what she wanted to do, and she was afraid that by getting married and sharing her power with a man, that she would somehow lose part of kind of her control over England. So there's a lot of theories that exist as to why Elizabeth never married. But she didn't, and so that's where she gets this nickname of the Virgin Queen. So let's talk about Elizabeth's rule, because Elizabeth is really a phenomenal ruler in England. And really, it's because she has a lot of success during her time as queen in a variety of different areas. She really focuses on trying to make England into a world power. So, and she's quite successful. And really, one of the things that transitions England into being a world power is them defeating what was called the Spanish Armada. And the Spanish Armada was a fleet, it was actually Spain's fleet, their kind of navy. And at that time, England was still a kind of like up and coming country, building their military. And Spain was kind of the powerhouse military. And in um, kind of a series of battles, the Spanish Armada attacks the English fleet, challenging them, and the English are actually successful and defeat the Spanish, destroying much of their warships. And in doing so, it makes England kind of the top dog and come out as kind of this world power not to be messed with. And interestingly enough, we'll talk about him more in our next unit, but the English Navy, Royal Navy as it's called, was overseen by a guy named Sir Francis Drake. And Sir Francis Drake was basically like a glorified pirate, where the Spanish were run by, very, well trained, organized naval men. They were beat by more or less just kind of like almost like a criminal of the high seas. So that was even more of a slap in the face. And Francis Drake would go on to be sponsored by Queen Elizabeth to go and do some exploration, which is actually Our second thing that we want to note is that this Elizabeth also began English exploration. She started to finance different projects, which at the time, exploration was going to be something that was going to help them be more competitive as a global power. And so they were going to go out and do a lot of exploring, especially of the Americas. They were going to start to, like, one of the famous English explorers was Henry Hudson, who did a lot of exploration in um, like the New York region, like the Hudson River, Hudson Bay, which you've probably heard of before, as well as start to kind of play with the idea of colonizing in the Americas. Fast forward some time, and our first real colony was really the establishment at Jamestown in Virginia. And if you think about Virginia, that state is named after Queen Elizabeth, whose nickname was the Virgin Queen. So that's actually where that comes from. And then the last thing that we want to mention about Elizabeth, that was something she was successful, was she established the English Renaissance. Established the English Renaissance by being a patron, Patron, of playwright William Shakespeare. So she, if we're talking about before with the Italian Renaissance, a lot of the patrons of the art in that time period in Italy, well, in England, instead, their focus was more so on um, kind of theater. And the very famous playwright of this time, William Shakespeare, kind of got his start because Elizabeth liked some of his plays and poems and stories. And so she would finance him writing more and more works. So you really have Queen Elizabeth to thank every time that you sit down and read one of his plays or works in English class. But at the time, they were performed here at the Globe Theatre, which is in London. Now, this is a reconstruction that was rebuilt because the original Globe Theatre burned down. But it looks very similar to what it would have looked like in that time period, where people would have come and stood and watched the plays, and up in the upper decks where there's seats, that would have been kind of the more luxurious areas, and the queen would have had a special box that she could go and see the plays. And later, then, when she got a little bit older, they would actually perform the plays in almost like her living room for her. Very famously, the play A Midsummer Night's Dream was performed right there in front of her for the first time. So she was a patron of theater, and so that kind of sparked what is called the English Renaissance, or also sometimes known as the Elizabethan Age. And so, because of this, Elizabeth was considered one of the best rulers in English history, and she, um, was is well regarded throughout her years, as kind of showing her from young Elizabeth to older Elizabeth, as being a very strong, capable leader in English history. So that's part 6.